This is Deuteronomy 8. The older generation failed their trial of difficult times in the desert, but Yahweh is just as concerned that the younger generation will fail their trial of easy times in the promised land. Verse 1. You shall observe to do all the commandments which I command you today, that you may live and multiply and go in and possess the land which Yahweh swore to your fathers. You shall remember all the way which Yahweh your God has led you these 40 years in the wilderness, that he might humble you, to prove you, to know what was in your heart, whether you would keep his commandments or not. He humbled you and allowed you to be hungry, and fed you with the manna which you didn't know, neither did your fathers know, that he might teach you that man does not live by bread only, but man lives by every word that proceeds out of Yahweh's mouth. Your clothing didn't grow old on you, neither did your foot swell these 40 years. You shall consider in your heart that as a man disciplines his son, so Yahweh your God disciplines you. Comment. In the desert there was nothing, and Yahweh provided everything. Verse 1, first on the list, he provided his commandments, which were the basis for success. Verses 2 and 3, he provided them with humility by leaving them with no apparent means of support. Then by supporting them himself like a grown-up supports children. Verse 3, he allowed them to be hungry and taught them by the manna to live by every word that proceeds out of his mouth. We don't see the connection there until we go back to Exodus 16, where they ran out of food about a month after they left Egypt. They were hungry. Then Yahweh's word came to them, quote, in the morning you shall be filled with bread, Exodus 16:12. That was a pretty crazy promise. Who would think they could be filled with bread in the desert? All they had to go on was Yahweh's word. They went to bed hungry, but sure enough, in the morning, the word became a reality, and the manna lay all around the camp. So they learned they could live by his word because he stood behind it. If he could make a word like that come to pass, he could make any word out of his mouth come to pass, and therefore they could live by every word that proceeds from the mouth of God. He didn't mention that he also provided them with thirst and then brought water from the rock to teach them the same thing. He performs his word, therefore we can live by it. He provided them with clothing, first by giving them stacks of it from the Egyptians, Exodus 12:35. Then, verse 4, by not allowing their clothes to wear out. Verse 4, he provided health by not allowing their feet to swell. They traveled without foot problems. Verse 5, he provided them with discipline, which proved he loved them as a father loves his son. The hardships, hunger, thirst, travel, living in tents was all discipline. Sadly, after all that, Yahweh found many of them faithless. If we go through a difficult time and we don't think we see the word being manifested, we should keep in mind the difficult time is in and of itself the fulfillment of his word. He promised discipline, so we shouldn't be surprised when we get it. We should be patient knowing the manifestations of the more pleasant promises are right around the corner. Verse 6, you shall keep the commandments of Yahweh your God, to walk in his ways and to fear him. For Yahweh your God brings you into a good land, a land of brooks of water, of springs, and underground water flowing into valleys and hills, a land of wheat and barley and vines and fig trees and pomegranates, a land of olive trees and honey, a land in which you shall eat bread without scarceness, and shall not lack anything in it, a land whose stones are iron, and out of whose hills you may dig copper. You shall eat and be full, and you shall bless Yahweh your God for the good land which he has given you. Comment. This younger generation made it successfully through Yahweh's trials in the desert. Now they're poised to enjoy the rewards of faith. They're not going to lack anything, which could actually work against them as we go to verse 11. Beware lest you forget Yahweh your God in not keeping his commandments and his ordinances and his statutes, which I command you today, lest when you have eaten and are full, and have built fine houses and lived in them, and when your herds and your flocks multiply, and your silver and your gold is multiplied, and all that you have is multiplied, then your heart might be lifted up, and you forget Yahweh your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage, who led you through the great and terrible wilderness with venomous snakes and scorpions, and thirsty ground where there was no water, who poured water for you out of the rock of flint, who fed you in the wilderness with manna, which your fathers didn't know, that he might humble you and that he might prove you, to do you good at your latter end. Comment. There's a short, pithy summary of why God brings trials. Quote, to do you good at your latter end. Verse 16. He's telling them, don't let the ease of the promised land make your faith get soft. Remember how I brought you here. It was miraculous. When you find yourselves fat and happy and rich and lazy, recognize the miracle of being there. You must remember the faith I taught you when it seemed there was no way you could even survive, much less enter this land. When you're living comfortably, how good is your memory of the desert going to be? Verse 17. And lest you say in your heart, my power and the might of my hand has gotten me this wealth. Comment, if their memory is honest and accurate, they'll look back and know that it was all because of Yahweh. Verse 18. But you shall remember Yahweh your God, for it is He who gives you power to get wealth, that He may establish His covenant which He swore to your fathers as it is today. Comment, if we're wealthy because of intelligence, virtue, or luck, from whence came those? Verse 18, quote, it is He who gives you power to get wealth. Verse 19, it shall be if you forget Yahweh your God and walk after other gods and serve them and worship them, I testify against you today that you shall surely perish. As the nations that Yahweh makes to perish before you, so you shall perish, because you wouldn't listen to Yahweh your God's voice. Comment, we will perish if we forget God. But why would we want to do that? There's nothing to satisfy here. We groan for the full manifestation of His word in our own promised land. That's the chapter. You can find Deuteronomy 9 at landofhavilah.net. Deuteronomy 9.